My life? Okay. On Wednesday, March 18th, I arrived in London and was informed by good Mr. Francis his master was better and was gone to Mr. Thrale's at Streatham, to which place I wrote to him begging to know when he would be in town. He was not expected for some time, but next day, having called on Dr. Taylor in Dean's Yard, Westminster, I found him there and was told he had come to town for a few hours. He met me with his usual kindness, but instantly returned to the writing of something on which he was employed when I came in, and on which he seemed much intent. Finding him thus engaged, I made my visit very short, and had no more of his conversation, except his expressing a serious regret that a friend of ours was living at too much expense, considering how poor an appearance he made. This is Langton, in a footnote it tells us. If, said Johnson, a man has splendor from his expense, if he spends his money in pride or in pleasure, he has value. But if he lets others spend it for him, which is most commonly the case, he has no advantage from it. On Friday, March 20th, I found him at his own house, sitting with Mrs. Williams, and was informed that the room formerly allotted to me was now appropriated to a charitable purpose. Mrs. Desmoulins, and I think her daughter, and a Miss Carmichael, being all lodged in it. This Mrs. Desmoulins was the daughter of Dr. Swinfen, Johnson's godfather, and a widow of Mr. Desmoulins, a writing master. Such was Johnson's humanity, and such was his generosity, that Mrs. Desmoulins herself told me he allowed her half a guinea a week. Let it be remembered that this was about a 12th part of his pension. His liberality, indeed, was at all periods of his life very remarkable. Mr. Howard of Lichfield, at whose father's house Johnson had in his early years been kindly received, told me that when he was a boy at the Charterhouse, his father wrote to him to go and pay a visit to Mr. Samuel Johnson, which he accordingly did, and found him in an upper room of poor appearance. Johnson received him with much courteousness, and talked a great deal to him as to a schoolboy of the course of his education and other particulars. When he afterwards came to know and understand the high character of this great man, he recollected his condescension with wonder. He added that when he was going away, Mr. Johnson presented him with half a guinea, and this, said Mr. Howard, was at a time when he probably had not another. We retired from Mrs. Williams to another room. Tom Davies soon after joined us. He had now unfortunately failed in his circumstances, and was much indebted to Dr. Johnson's kindness for obtaining for him many alleviations of his distress. After he went away, Johnson blamed his folly in quitting the stage, by which he and his wife got £500 a year. I said I believed it was owing to Churchill's attack upon him. He mouths the sentence as curs mouth the bone. Johnson said to this, I believe so too, sir, but what a man is he who is to be driven from the stage by a line? Another line would have driven him from his shop. I told him that I was engaged as counsel at the bar of the House of Commons to oppose a road bill in the county of Stirling, and asked him what mode he would advise me to follow in addressing such an audience. Johnson said, Why, sir, you must provide yourself with a good deal of extraneous matter, which you are to produce occasionally, so as to fill up the time. For you must consider that you do not listen much, for they do not listen much. If you begin with the strength of your case, it may be lost before they begin to listen. When you catch a moment of attention, press the merits of the question upon them. He said as to one point of the merits that he thought it would be a wrong thing to deprive the small landholders of the privilege of assessing themselves for making and repairing the high roads. It was destroying a certain portion of liberty without a good reason, which was always a bad thing. When I mentioned this observation next day to Mr. Wilkes, he pleasantly said, "What? Does he talk of liberty? Liberty is as ridiculous in his mouth as religion is in mine." Mr. Wilkes' advice as to the best mode of speaking at the bar of the House of Commons was not more respectful towards the Senate than that of Dr. Johnson's. "Be as impudent as you can, as merry as you can, and say whatever comes uppermost. Jack Lee is the best heard there of any council, and he is the most impudent dog and always abusing us." In my interview with Dr. Johnson this evening, I was quite easy, quite as his companion, upon which I find in my journal the following reflection. So ready is my mind to suggest matter for dissatisfaction that I felt a sort of regret that I was now so easy. I missed that awful reverence with which I used to contemplate Mr. Samuel Johnson and the complex magnitude of his literary, moral, and religious character. I have a wonderful, superstitious love of mystery, when perhaps the truth is that it is owing to the cloudy darkness of my own mind. I should be glad that I am more advanced in my progress of being, so that I can view Dr. Johnson with a steadier and clearer eye. My dissatisfaction tonight was foolish. Would it not be foolish to regret that we still have a less mystery in a future state? That we now see in a glass darkly, but shall then see face to face? This reflection, which I thus freely communicate, will be valued by the thinking part of my readers, who may have themselves experienced a similar state of mind. He returned next day to Streatham, to Mr. Thrale's, where, as Mr. Strahan once complained to me, he was in a great measure absorbed from the society of his old friends. I was kept in London by business, and wrote to him on the 27th that a separation from him for a week, when we were so near, was equal to a separation for a year, when we were at 400 miles distance. I went to Streatham on Monday, March 30th. Before he appeared, Mrs. Thrale made a very characteristical remark. "I do not know for certain what will please Dr. Johnson, but I know for certain that it will displease him to praise anything, even what he likes, extravagantly." At dinner he laughed at querulous declamations against the age on account of luxury, increase of London, scarcity of provisions, and other such topics. "Houses," said Johnson, "will be built till rents fall, and corn is more plentiful now than ever it was." I had before dinner repeated a ridiculous story told me by an old man who had been a passenger with me in the stagecoach today. Mrs. Thrale, having taken occasion to allude to it in a talking to me, called it "the story told you by the old woman." "Now, madame," said I, "give me leave to catch you in the fact. It was not an old woman, but an old man, whom I mentioned as having told me this." I presumed to take an opportunity in presence of Johnson of showing this lively lady how ready she was, unintentionally, to deviate from exact authenticity of narration. "Thomas A. Kempis," he observed, "must be a good book, as the world has opened its arms to receive it. It is said to have been printed in one language or other, as many times as there have been months since it first came out. The first edition was 1492. Between that period and 1792, according to this account, there are 3,600 editions. But this is very improbable, says very analytical editor here, M. He's a little... reading that a little too literally. Anyway, back to the story at hand. I always was struck with this sentence in it. "Be not angry that you cannot make others as you wish them to be, since you cannot make yourselves as you wish to be." That's a good line. Johnson said, "I was angry with Hurd about Cowley for having published a selection of his works. But upon better consideration, I think there is no impropriety in a man's publishing as much as he chooses of any author, if he does not put the rest out of the way. A man, for instance, may print the Odes of Horace alone. He seemed to be in a more indulgent humor than when the subject was discussed between him and Mr. Murphy. See page 737, which was a while ago. In fact, I don't remember it anymore. When we were at tea and coffee, there came in Lord Trimlestown, in whose family was an ancient Irish peerage, but it suffered by taking the generous side of the troubles of the last century. There's another footnote here from M. This isn't Boswell. Since this was written, the trainer has been reversed, and Nicholas Barneswell is now a peer of Ireland with this title. The person mentioned in this text has studied physics, which is physicians, and prescribed gratis to the poor. Hence arose the subsequent conversation. Let's see if that clears this up. He was a man of pleasing conversation and was accompanied by a young gentleman, his son. I mentioned that I had in my possession the life of Sir Robert Sibbald. Oh, that's the end of that, I guess. Or does he come up later in this? Lord Trimlestown. Remember that name. Okay. I mentioned that I had in my possession the life of Sir Robert Sibbald, the celebrated Scottish antiquary and founder of the Royal College of Physicians at Edinburgh, in the original manuscript in his own handwriting. And that it was, I believe, the most natural and candid account of himself that ever was given by any man. As an instance, he tells that the Duke of Perth, then Chancellor of Scotland, pressed him very much to come over to the Roman Catholic faith, that he resisted all his Grace's arguments for a considerable time, till one day he felt himself, as it were, instantaneously convinced, and with tears in his eyes ran into the Duke's arms and embraced the ancient religion, that he continued very steady in it for some time. He continued very steadily in it for some time, and accompanied his Grace to London one winter, and lived in his household. That there he found the rigid fasting prescribed by the Church very severe upon him, that this disposed him to reconsider the controversy, and having then seen that he was in the wrong, he returned to Protestantism. I talked of some time or other publishing this curious life. Mrs. Thrale said, I think you had as well let alone that publication. To discover such weakness exposes a man when he is gone. Johnson answered, Nay, it is an honest picture of human nature. How often are the primary motives of our greatest actions as small as Sibbald's for his reconversion? Mrs. Thrale said, But may they not as well be forgotten? Johnson said, No, madam, a man loves to review his own mind. That is the use of a diary or a journal. Oh, here's Lord Trimlestown butting in finally. True, sir, as the ladies love to see themselves in a glass, so a man likes to see himself in his journal. I said, A very pretty allusion. Johnson said, Yes, indeed. I said, And as a lady adjusts her dress before a mirror, a man adjusts his character by looking at his journal. I next year found the very same thought in Atterbury's funeral sermon on Lord Cutts, where, having mentioned his diary, her diary, he says, In this glass she every day dressed her mind. This is a proof of coincidence and not of plagiarism, for I had never read that sermon before. Next morning, while we were at breakfast, Johnson gave a very earnest recommendation of what he himself practiced with the utmost conscientiousness. I mean, a strict attention to truth, even in the most minute particulars. Accustom your children, said Johnson, constantly to this. If a thing happened in one window, and they, when relating it, say that it happened at another, do not let it pass, but instantly check them. You do not know where deviation from truth will end. I said. It may come to the door, and when one once an account is at all varied in one circumstance, it may by degrees be varied so as to be totally different from what really happened. Our lively hostess, whose fancy was impatient of the rain, fidgeted at this and ventured to say, Nay, this is too much. If Mr. Johnson should forbid me to drink tea, I would comply, as I should feel the restraint only twice a day. But little variations in narrative must happen 1,000 times a day, if one is not perpetually watching. Johnson answered, Well, madame, and you ought to be perpetually watching. It is more from carelessness about truth than from intentional lying that there is so much falsehood in the world. Fair enough, Johnson, fair enough. In his review of Dr. Warden's Essays on the Writings and Genius of Pope, Johnson has given the following salutary caution upon the subject. Nothing but experience could evince the frequency of false information or enable any man to conceive that so many groundless reports should be propagated as every man of eminence may hear of himself. Some men relate what they think as what they know. Some men of confused memories and habitual inaccuracy ascribe to one man what belongs to another. And some talk on without thought or care. A few men are sufficient to broach falsehoods which are afterwards innocently diffused by successive relators. That's from the Literary Magazine, 1756, page 37. Had he lived to read what Sir John Hawkins and Mrs. Piozzi have related concerning himself, Boswell hasn't complained about them in a while. How much would he have found his observation illustrated? He was indeed so much impressed with the prevalence of falsehood, voluntary or unintentional, that I never know any person who, upon hearing an extraordinary circumstance told, discovered more of the incredulous Odai. He would say, with a significant look and decisive tone, It is not so. Do not tell me this again. He inculcated, so to be fair to Johnson, what he said right there is, it is not so. Do not tell this again. I read it wrong as, it is not so. Do not tell me this again. So if we're going to be talking about total transparency truth, I got to say what actually is on the page. He inculcated upon all his friends the importance of perpetual vigilance against the slightest degree of falsehood, the effect of which, as Sir Joshua Reynolds observed to me, has been that all who were of his school are distinguished for a love of truth and accuracy, which they would not have possessed at the same degree if they had not been acquainted with Johnson. And now to this quote I misquoted earlier, but then corrected myself. There's a footnote. So the quote was, it is not so, do not tell this again. And the footnote says, the following plausible but overprudent counsel on this subject is given by an Italian writer. It says here in footnotes, in brackets, that's Dante. Quoted by Ridi degeneratione insectorum with the epithet of divinae poetae. Sempre quel ver cha fascia de menzogosna de leon scinder. Okay, it's in Italian. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. It's from Dante's Inferno 11:124. Here's the translation. Always to that truth which has the appearance of a lie, a man should close his lips as much as he can, lest without sin he be put to shame. Always to the truth which has the appearance of a lie, a man should close his lips as much as he can, lest without sin be he put to shame. Okay, and the next footnote, which comes later on this page, does not look fun to read, but I think I'm done for the day, so I'll worry about that tomorrow. Until next time, that's my cover and my back covers and the side cover. The spine is falling off now, so. Well, we're not really near the end, but we're more than certainly more than halfway through now. So I guess it was going to happen sooner or later. Anyway, till next time, bye from Boswell.